right, so why don't we get started? It's good to have everyone on today. So we have here today Miss Louisa D Pearce. Louisa is a social worker, embodied processing practitioner, trainer, and author. She has recovered from multiple diagnoses, including schizophrenia, gaining direct insight into psychospiritual distress and healing. Her career includes work as a researcher, peer worker, and trainer for Voices VIC, Hearing Voices Network, National Consumer Consultant for HealthScope, Australia-wide, operations manager and trainer for peer-to-peer, Sunshine Coast, counselor trainer in her private practice, The Voice Sanctuary. She's also the author of Spirit Gnosis, Hearing Voices, and The Little Girl That Nobody Wanted. It's such a pleasure and an honor to introduce you today, Louisa. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Sonia. It is a pleasure as well. I am tanked up on coffee and blueberries. It's nearly midnight. In fact, yeah, it's just about midnight here in Australia. But I was kept awake by Craig Steele's wonderful keynote. So yeah, that's been great to listen to and just to absorb the vibe of this beautiful conference. Hearing what Craig had to say made me feel like I was in great company, definitely with my tribe. And I really hope that what I'm going to present for you guys is going to be a nice, I guess, tangible, practical expression of a lot of the things that he was talking about. So I'm sitting here in a virtual forest on purpose. Because this is my talk is a sanctuary in the forest. I will describe in great detail what I got up to in the forest. I ran the Respite in March this year, and I was just really excited about it. It was a culmination of a lot of things that I had been working on both personally and professionally, and I wanted to share it. So yeah, so I'm here with my excitement and my forest behind me. I'm going to talk for possibly up to an hour. We'll see how we go. And there's going to be plenty of time for questions. So please just, yeah, put them in the chat as you think of them. And Sonia and I will hopefully be able to go through them at the end.
Yes.
I'm also going to, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm also going to share some slides with you. I prepared them knowing that this was virtual and I wouldn't be in front of you. So I made you some pretty slides that would hopefully in some ways transcribe the feeling and the beauty of the place that we were doing our respite in. So as you all are aware, it's an Australian peer-led respite for post-psychosis integration using a biopsychosocial spiritual approach. And I'm going to unpack all of those terms and you'll see how they all fit together. Before I do anything though, any more than what I've already done, I just want to do something that we take very seriously here in Australia. We like to acknowledge country. It's our way of paying respects to the ancestors, to the spirit beings, to the nature beings, to the elements, and most especially to the elders who take care of our land, who have done for thousands and thousands of years, our Indigenous people, the First Nations people of Australia. I'd like to acknowledge the country where I come from, which is Jinnabara Kabi country, and also acknowledge the countries and the lands where you are all coming from, in all different parts of the world, I imagine. So just tuning in for a moment to honour and thank the land that holds us, which we quite often take for granted, but as the minute we sort of drop our attention there, we find the support. So acknowledgement to country. And then the other acknowledgement I want to make is, I call it my acknowledgement of many truths. And I definitely heard Craig describing that in his own terms today. For me, this is very important because having experienced psychosis, having lived through many extreme states. Some of them were not psychotic. Some of them have been mystical, what you might call religious peak experiences that lots of people haven't understood. And I've tried to relay the truth of my experience to them in the past, being met with ridicule, being met with derision, being met with confusion, and sometimes outright hostility to my truth. So when I train these days, I never want to make the same mistake. I never want to impose my view on someone else. And I like to acknowledge that we can hold space for many truths, that multiple truths are possible, and that our truths are built on assumptions, which at the best of times are shaky and may not be true at all. So, so I like to hold my beliefs lightly. And I ask you to do the same as you're watching this presentation, and to just take whatever is valuable and leave the rest as not serving you, and that's completely fine. So I'm going to start today just with a bit of background as to why I might be running a post-psychosis respite in a forest in Australia in 2024. I have to take us back to a younger version of myself. When I was preparing this slide presentation, I found this very serious looking version of Louisa sitting in a forest. Would have been early 20s. I was camping, and I'm writing in my journal. I spend a lot of time writing in journals my whole life. Most of those journals are filled with angst-ridden questions about my place in the universe, the things that really confused and confounded me. And as I write there on the side, I guess I would describe myself as free-spirited, spiritual, and wise right from my young childhood. Yet I've always also been deeply troubled by my relationship with the world and myself. And especially at that age, a young adult, not understanding how I fit into this world. I feel as though my psychoses, because I have had many, were the inevitable result of so much inattention. And I must also pay homage just quickly to Craig Steele, Professor Craig Steele, who mentioned trauma, because when I work with psychosis these days as a social worker, very much using a trauma-based model, but not exclusively, but that is a large focus of mine. And a large focus of my own healing was understanding my trauma. So you could transpose the word tension for trauma. It wasn't a kind of a obvious trauma in the sense of perhaps physical or sexual abuse, or a home with domestic violence or anything like that. It was more a case of emotional trauma, psychological neglect, a kind of subtle, chronic, low-grade trauma that just compounded and compounded as life happened to me. So under the strain of all that tension, in the early 20s, I did have some psychotic symptoms, but it wasn't until age 36, so this is now 2010, that I had a complete psychotic break, a very dramatic psychotic break, in which my high-functioning world completely collapsed. I was hearing voices 24/7. I couldn't sleep, and I wandered around in an unmedicated psychosis for about 3 months before I finally turned up at a hospital and received high doses of Seroquel. I call it my ego collapse. You know, the word psychosis didn't always fit for me. I felt that it was a collapse of my entire ego. But it also provided the fertile ground for true healing, because prior to that, and you can see the studious young Louisa writing away in her journal, I was always trying to fix myself. I always felt that there was a deep, deep problem within me that needed fixing. And I was right, there was one, but it was psychosis which had the power to really get that healing going. So this photo here, I'll have to explain this. This is a sangoma from South Africa. I was actually born in South Africa. Part of my trauma history is immigration in my early teens. When I was 12 years old, we moved from South Africa to New Zealand, and then later to Australia. In South Africa, they have medicine men and women. They call them sangomas. They are the shamans of South Africa. And when I had my psychosis, I knew deep down I was going through a spiritual emergency, a term that Stanislav Grof used in his book, Spiritual Emergencies. But for lack of other options, I entered the mental health system. So I wanted a sangoma, I wanted a shaman, I wanted somebody in a forest, preferably, to take me under their wing and show me what was happening and teach me how to heal. But there were no options to do that at the time. So I entered the mental health system and I found some help, but I also found some harm. And because of my experiences through the mental health system, so I'm talking about standard hospitalizations, high doses of antipsychotic medication, as well as basically anything I could do that I thought might help me. So I did all sorts of trauma-based therapies. I did high nutritional doses of vitamin C. I did cold water baths. I threw everything at my healing. So I've had quite a colorful healing experience. And the good thing about that today is that I can speak to that when I'm working with clients. I can help clients who are also navigating their way through the various healing options. But most of all, my experiences at that time have now inspired me to really help others. I wanted to create something that I probably needed at that time. Now, my respite is not for people going through a psychosis. My respite is for post-psychosis. And that is an important point to make, because I don't feel that I could, right now in my personal and professional capacity, I could hold space to run a respite for people going through psychosis. I believe that these places are needed and they should be there. But the way that I've found to begin to do this work, I'm imagining I'm going to be doing this work for the next 30 years of my life. So maybe one day I will run an actual respite for people going through psychosis. But this is a wonderful beginning for me, because I see that there is a need for people who have had psychosis to now have an opportunity to look back on those experiences and integrate and heal. Before I launch further into that, though, I just want to also give you guys a bit of a background in terms of my practice frameworks. So you can understand where I'm coming from, because as I mentioned before, my truth is built on assumptions, and my truth is built on my worldview and my experiences, and some of the things that I've learned through my training. So my practice frameworks are kind of in this order. I began as a peer worker, so I've got a really strong foundation in intentional peer support. Also, the hearing voices approach, something which I call, and I can't lay claim to this, but I've heard it called as well, the biopsychosocial spiritual model, adding in that spiritual component, which is so often missing in conventional traditional care. Trauma-informed care and practice always been a focus for me, mainly because of my own trauma history. I later went on and studied social work and got very interested in the critical theories, anti-oppressive theory, systems theory. I really enjoy a deviance theory. I really enjoy theories that criticize our society, essentially, and kind of point the finger rather at, the person's got the problem. Well, hang on a minute, what's going on in our society? I'm glad to hear Professor Steele talking about CBT, because I've come around to actually really appreciate CBT as a modality when it's used well, and I do use it in my own practice. I've also done embodied processing, which is somatic therapy, and interestingly, we use a lot of the imagery re-scripting that Dr. Steele was talking about too. And lastly, metaphysical energy healing. Now, that's my fancy, more scientific word for shamanism, for shamanic practices, for energy medicine. I am trained in foundational energy medicine, and I practice it a lot in my own life. I don't practice it with clients so much, but this mainly because I'm in a role as a social worker, so it's outside the scope of that practice. But when I was doing the respite, I did find a lot of ways to weave shamanism in whilst being very respectful of the worldviews of the participants. So it was a kind of a co-designed thing, which you'll see as I explain it further. And lastly, I just want to make reference to this picture that you probably noticed as soon as I pulled the slide up. I call this picture the art of two-eyed seeing. And I have borrowed that phrase from Dr. Lewis Madrona, who might be familiar to some of you as another wonderful psychiatrist who's also a Lakota man, who works with what he calls two-eyed seeing, the ability to see through the lens of traditional Western medical model, and also the indigenous, the shamanic, the ancient ways of seeing and knowing in our world. In this case, represented by a chicken, a humble chicken. So I'm certainly one of these people. I have a strong shamanic worldview, and I cannot separate that from my practice. I don't impose it on my clients, but this respite was a wonderful opportunity for me really to present something that honored both perspectives. So let's go back to the idea that I had originally. 6 potentially psychotic people in a forest for 5 days. What could go wrong? And it was interesting how I had a lot of, initially when I started setting this up and I booked the accommodation and I got the advertisements out there and the participants came to me, it all really happened really very quickly. And once it was all locked in, people had paid, everything was paid, it was going to happen. This picture sums up how I was feeling. A kind of terror came over me. I was probably about 3 months out of the respite, and maybe that terror was partly because people that I was telling I was doing this would say, "Oh my gosh, you're brave." I was like, I started to think about it and thought, am I? You know, what am I doing here? You know, it had elements of a kind of an initiation, a sense of an initiation, a sense that we were all going to go somewhere really, really deep together. And I was just, you know, as the leader of this, as the creator, well, it's a co-creation, of course, when you become when you're actually on the respite, but because I had conceived of it, I felt so responsible for what happened in that cave that you're visualizing. So yeah, these waves of cold fear would come over me. I just felt them, I acknowledged them, I understood that, you know, that they needed to pass through my body. And this is the way that I dealt with them. This is the way that I deal with everything. I'm a very logical person as well. I planned. I planned and planned and planned and planned. For every, you know, but I also balanced that with intuitive visions and even dreams. I received one night in particular, a kind of a half waking dream, which laid out the entire structure of the respite. I could see what we were going to do and when, the entire itinerary. So of course, the next morning I very quickly got up, wrote it all down, and that was our blueprint. That was our map that was going to get us through this forest. You know, I feel strongly that we need a map when we're doing these kinds of things. We might let them go if things change. And of course, you know, Great Spirit always has other ideas about how things are really going to unfold. But the map is something you can come back to. The map gave me a sense of security. And in the planning, and I wasn't alone in this because I had 2 wonderful co-facilitators, and I also asked my participants, what would they like to happen on the respite? What ideas did they want to see manifest? So as we were planning, the aims of this became very clear. My aims were to help people to trust themselves and their experiences. I found that the experience of psychosis shatters trust in self, the world, in others. And perhaps most saddest of all, trust in their spiritual nature, trust in the cosmos or God or universe or whatever they would like to call it. So I wanted to reestablish trust. I wanted to help people integrate difficult emotions and thoughts that had arisen from their psychotic experiences and or the treatment that they received when they were getting treatment, because a lot of people have identified that they were traumatized by those treatments. I wanted to help them frame their stories in positive ways and reclaim their connection to self, the world, and the cosmos. And that word connection is going to come in as very important. You'll see a little later on. So just to describe our people and to take an opportunity to show you some cute koalas from Australia. I want to, honor and acknowledge and thank all of the people that were involved in this. So my two co-facilitators, I trusted implicitly. And I think this is just so important. If anyone was going to venture in to do something like this, we really need to trust those wingmen, those people at our side. The two ladies they'd both experienced non-ordinary states of consciousness, and in one case, extreme psychosis. They had both fully recovered, or recovered to a point of being very, very well, very, very grounded, very, very capable. They both had mental health training and lots of experience holding space. So I felt very safe working with them because I knew if I started to get a bit wobbly, I could fall back, lean into their support. And then our people. So we actually invited 4 people to come on it. One person pulled out right at the last minute, not to be, that was expected, I should say, because the cohort of people that I work with, they struggle enormously. This particular lady had never really traveled interstate before. So for her, coming was, going to be a huge, huge ask. So she didn't make it, but we ended up with 3. So we had, they all flew on planes. They all got on planes and left their comfortable little lives and came up to this forest in Queensland where I live. One of them had 6 episodes of extreme psychosis. Each of those episodes had resulted in, intense hospital stays and a kind of a falling apart of her life. We had one man who had only had 1 psychosis in his early 20s. He was now in his 40s, but that psychosis had been so powerful, so intense in experience, and he never had a chance to really understand it. And it had always bothered him. And it was a chance for him to kind of, I guess, address that and move on. And then the third lady had about 20 psychoses over her lifetime. She was in her 60s, I believe. So, yeah, so we had those were just to give you a snapshot of the kinds of beautiful participants that we worked with. But remember, we all had lived experience. So in a sense, I felt like we were all going to be healed from this. It wasn't just facilitators and participants, us and them dynamic. This is a shot of our sanctuary. So there is some nice brochure shots of this house and this forest on sunny days. But I didn't show you that. I showed you what it actually looked like when we were staying there. We were shrouded by rain. We had essentially 4 days of rain. And when it rains in tropical Queensland, it rains. And it's very magical. It's very beautiful. It created a lovely kind of cocoon, a sense of being held by this beautiful, beautiful place. It's 40 acres of rainforest. It's completely private. We stayed in this house and we could walk around through the forest, different trails. And most magically of all, there was a waterfall, which became a big part of our journey that I'll explain a bit later. So this is what I would call a therapeutic milieu. If anyone has come across that term before, it's been used quite a lot, especially since I believe it was used first around the 1940s when returning veterans from the war came back with PTSD symptoms. And so spaces were created that would be therapeutic in the countryside, not too clinical, really attending to the relationships and the environment that it would feel safe and lovely. So this term has stuck with us. And this is just a quote from a recent systematic review on the therapeutic milieu. It is more than just the setting. It is a healing culture rich in therapeutic interpersonal relationships and cooperative attentiveness to patients. In addition, its physical features are soothing and provide for optimum safety and comfort. So it's the whole package. It's a very holistic concept. Now, elements of our therapeutic milieu, there's 6 of them that I'm going to go through as a kind of a guide to these slides. So nature, safety, also known as containment, peer support, structure, embodied participation, also known as involvement, and validation. Now, the last 5 are based on the work of Gunderson, who wrote a lot about the therapeutic milieu in the 70s. He called safety containment, and he called embodied participation involvement. The other person that I really kind of used to help me plan my journey was Judith Herman. In her book, Trauma and Recovery, she wrote about 3 stages of the trauma recovery. The first being safety, the second being remembrance and mourning, and the third being reconnection. She also wrote, it's not in that list, but she wrote a lot about restoring autonomy, restoring agency to the person. And again, I heard Professor Steele talk about that empowerment. So critical. That to me comes in under reconnection. It's very much a part of the 3rd stage, restoring power. So I wanted to try and achieve all of these 3 things. A quick shout out to Dr. Sandra Bloom. I didn't have a slide for her, but she created the sanctuary model, and her psychiatric unit was also based on similar principles of the therapeutic milieu. So we have a long and wonderful history of people who've been working with this stuff. All right, let's dive into what we did. So nature. Nature was where I really wanted to start. Nature was why I chose the forest. And I believe that nature is our home in the deepest of senses, because we are each an extension of our great Mother Earth. And when we invite a deliberate and conscious connection with her, when we sync with her rhythms, her seasons, and her heartbeat, we find natural peace and healing. The forest held us in a way that I don't think any kind of, setting in suburbia, or even a setting in a beautiful place near the beach, but perhaps there's some houses around. I think we needed that complete solitude. I think we needed nature to be bigger than us. And I think when humans put themselves in environments where nature is bigger than them, they feel that they are a child of this planet. They are a child held by Mother Earth. There's a sense of wonder and awe that comes about from these environments. So I knew that nature was going to be my kind of unpaid facilitator, if you like, on this respite. That she would have a huge hand in creating the beautiful vibration. And indeed, there is, I'm not too much of a science nerd to be able to go deeply into this, but I enjoy this kind of thing, that knowing that the Schumann resonance, which is said to be the natural heartbeat of the earth, the ever-present frequency emanating from this planet, that averages at 7.85 hertz. And it's interesting because it's the similar frequency to the theta brainwaves, between 4 to 8 hertz. And these brainwaves are when we are relaxed, we are creative, we are meditating. It's just that light sleep. It's memory consolidation. Just as we're falling asleep, we consolidate our memories. It's really great for problem solving, for intuition, and for emotional processing. And if you look at that list, all of that is integration. So again, the unpaid facilitator was nature, just providing that beautiful frequency, which was going to help everybody to relax. And that was important because we needed safety. Now, this little guy, see, I thought if my presentation's boring, I will just woo everybody with the Australian animals. This is a sugar glider. They're very, very small and extremely cute. And he does look as if he would just run away at the smallest hint of human presence. So I think this little guy needs safety. And I knew that my people needed safety too. I knew that I needed safety, that I couldn't do this if I didn't feel safe. I feel that we need we need to feel relaxed to feel safe, and we need to feel safe to integrate. Otherwise, the work won't be deep. So how did I create safety? Well, like I said, I'm a big planner, so I gave this a lot of thought. First of all, I wanted to cultivate physical safety. I know that you can go and do kind of boot camp experiences in the forest where you have to like sleep out in a sleeping bag all by yourself under the stars and listen to all the spooky animal noises and then wake up the next morning feeling like you've conquered something. There's a place for all of that, but not for my people. For my people, they were traveling, even getting on a plane was a big deal. Meeting strangers was a big deal. Committing to spending 5 days in a rainforest was a big deal. So I didn't want to push them any more out of their comfort zone than I needed to. So we really, made sure that they had privacy, they had private rooms, comfortable amenities, a balanced routine, and healthy meals so that they could stay grounded and just feel supported in that physical way. The psychological safety, of course, this is the less tangible things, but I was certainly paying attention to it the whole way through. First of all, our screening and interview process was partly to make sure that the people we selected were going to get along and were roughly at the same kind of level of readiness or level of learning, so that, there wouldn't be that sort of disconnect. And during the screening and interview process, I kind of made my participants fill in questionnaires, and then I had an online interview, and I was really assessing for, are they ready? And do they have good self-care practices already in place? We wanted people who had experienced psychosis, yes, but had also over time developed a good set of self-care tools that they could use. They knew what to do when they became ungrounded. They knew what to do when they became triggered. It wouldn't be that we wouldn't support them, but they had to have that basic foundation in place. And again, that spoke to my capacity. I guess as I get more experienced in this, I can probably loosen the grip a little bit on on that. But for this one, I just really wanted to make sure that it worked well. So that process was important, and also my communication in that interview process, my preparation process, which is the pre-respite communication via emails, via literature that I sent them. There was one lady who needed a couple of check-ins. I was very happy to speak to her on the phone. All of that was helping them to feel safe with me. Yeah, again, like they're coming all the way to spend 5 days in a rainforest with a total stranger. They had to feel safe with me. So, little things like if they asked me to do something, I would do it. I would get back to them. I would follow up with communication. I was just so careful to help them feel safe with me, that they could count on me, they could rely on me. Also managing expectations with that, being really clear about our community guidelines, what was expected of them. And through all of those means, encouraging the following things, which I think are foundational to safety: freedom to express emotions while respecting others, of course. We're not going to yell at everybody, but if you want to be angry, you can be angry. You can express it in art or, yelling in the forest or doing whatever you need to do. Freedom of belief and speech while respecting others. Freedom of choice, wanting to give them choice. At no point did I want to coerce somebody to do something that they didn't want to do. And I made that so abundantly clear that they didn't have to join in things. Things were encouraged, but you don't have to do anything. And I didn't want people to be pulled into a kind of a group think. Again, I wanted to encourage autonomy and agency as a way to restore their own personal power. And respecting boundaries. That's respecting their own boundaries, but also respecting other people's boundaries. If somebody said they needed some time out, we weren't going to bother them. We were going to respect that and not sort of push at them. So I will show you an example now of how we did it, because I'm not a big fan of like setting a whole lot of rules down on paper. So I tried to sort of weave in, again, this is weaving in a little bit of the shamanism here. I had a document called Animal Wisdom, And it was what we went through on our very first night. We talked about each of the different animals that they might meet in the forest and the medicine of those animals, the messages of those animals. This is echidna. This is another Australian animal. It looks a bit like a porcupine, I suppose. It has these spikes. So echidna wisdom tells us to take time out if you need to. And by the way, this text is taken from this document that the participants received. So when echidna feels threatened, she tucks up in a ball, displays her spikes, and nestles into the ground, the safety of Mother Earth. You can protect yourself if you need to. Take time out, curl up in a ball, and let yourself sink into the embrace of Mother Earth. She knows your heart and has infinite patience. So I guess I wanted to share that to kind of share the tone and the way that we communicated these things to our participants to help them be assured that it was okay to do that. Now, the third way that we encourage psychological safety is we enable different worldviews and a culture of non-judgment using this adapted biopsychosocial spiritual model. Now, I'm sure most people listening will be familiar with the biopsychosocial model. It's a very kind of standard textbook, holistic way of looking at mental health. Obviously, the biological is the physical side, the neurochemistry, the physical, the sleep, the rest, the diet, the psychological, what's going on in the inner world of the person, their emotions, their belief systems, their schemas, the social, the environment that they belong to, the community, and the tensions between themselves and the social world. And then there's the piece missing that always kind of bothers me, and that's why I always put it in, is the spiritual, because I just think it cannot be ignored. It's especially when we're working with people who've experienced psychosis or non-ordinary states of consciousness. I've yet to meet one that didn't have some spiritual component to that experience, that didn't have at least some questions about where these experiences were coming from, whether it's other dimensions or some kind of a religious framework for understanding it or spiritual framework. So when we actually had a psychoeducation session on the second morning, the first full day, and it was called Worldviews of Psychosis. And what I did is I went through every worldview on psychosis that I could find and I shoved it into a book, and then I tried to teach it in a 2-hour lecture, which was some feat. But, you know, it was snapshots, and we got there. What I did is gave them I called it a smorgasbord. I don't know if people know what that is. It's like a buffet lunch, right? Where you can pick and choose. I wanted the participants to be able to pick and choose what belief systems they liked, what matched their experience. Maybe it was biological for them, maybe nutritional deficiencies, or, you know, but as long as that they felt safe to choose their own view and not subscribe to anybody else's. That was the main point. Okay, so yeah, I will move on now and talk about the third component of the therapeutic milieu, which is the peer support. I mean, I hate to be elitist because I think everybody to some degree can experience, can relate to not to extreme states of consciousness. We've all had weird dreams where we kind of feel that they're around the next day, or maybe we've heard the voice of somebody that's died in our family, or, you know, most people can kind of find some way to relate to psychosis. And I think clinicians and people that work in the space that don't have lived experience have to draw on those things to really help them connect. But the beauty of having peer support is that that's an automatic given. There is that sense of we get it. And I just wanted to utilize it because that's my background. As I said, I'm not elitist about it, but and I would welcome non-lived experience on future respites. But the way that this one worked out is we had a beautiful gathering of people who'd all gone through it at some point. Interestingly, the principles of peer support align beautifully with the therapeutic milieu. In both models of care, we find common principles. So if you look on the left there, this is from the 1940s and 60s, or through to 60s. We've got these things like egalitarian, permissiveness, allowing people to do what they want, honesty, openness, and trust. And in peer support, we have things like reciprocity, mutuality, different words for egalitarian, choice and control, transparency, lived experience disclosure, and connection. As facilitators, our role was really important too. We were role modeling comfort with our own stories and beliefs, lack of judgment for self or others, acceptance of our own vulnerabilities, a curiosity and a willingness to learn, the use of skill and knowledge. So things that we had learned on our path, we were actually using it, when we needed to. Balance and mental well-being, and leadership. And here I just kind of popped in brackets. I see good leadership in these kinds of situations as being wise, kind, and strong, which is based on the circle of security. Wise, kind, that's a parenting model, but wise, kind, and strong helps people to feel safe. Now I'm going to move along to the structure because this is really the meat. This is really everything else, I suppose, is setting up our ability to work through the structure and for it to be successful. By successful, I mean for us to achieve our aims of helping people integrate. There has to be a path to follow, for without a path, the forest can feel frightening. Now, if you remember that cave metaphor that I put up at the beginning, the sense of, oh God, what are we getting ourselves into? We're going into this scary dark forest or this cave and we might get lost. So the structure is what provided our map. One map we used was the connected self, and I share this with participants, again, as part of our psychoeducation, and it was really just things for them to think about. It was something that people did personally, to think about which area of connection they needed to work on. All of them are ultimately important, and wholeness and healing relies on connection in all of these domains. The first one is connection to self, and I will also say the body. So to the body and the mind and the feelings, that's connection to self. Connection to earth, country, nature. Connection to family, loved ones. Connection to community, culture, society, you could add there. Connection to ancestors and guides, and this one is often missing in the Western models because a lot of times people don't believe in ancestors and guides, but in the shamanic model, they certainly do. And connection to universe, spirit, and God. So I wanted people to see that there might be an area for them to work on here. And for a lot of people, it was connection to self. But for other people, it was connection to the universe, reestablishing that faith, that trust in the bigger, the numinous, that which we don't always understand. Connection is a grounding force. It keeps us in the here and the now. It locates us in time and space and brings a sense of belonging and comfort. Connection activates our ventral vagus nerve, the part of our autonomic nervous system, which is responsible for feelings of calm, peace, and happiness. And connection is also about relationship. When we connect to something, we have a relationship with it. This was taken from my Respite teaching guide. All right, I'm going to describe the journey now of what we actually did so you get a really clear sense of that. So as I mentioned already, there was a preparation period, and this was even before we got on the Respite. People were on the Respite, right? Because what happens is we start to imagine, we start to plan, we book flights, we worry about things, we visualize it in our minds. And I knew all of that was going on for all of us. So I counted that first stage as being a part of safety. If you remember Judith Herman's stages, we had to make sure that people felt safe enough to get on those planes. And that did, as I mentioned, entail a bit of work for me. I had to sometimes soothe some anxieties, have some phone calls with people, and just, again, non-coercively say, look, it's really up to you. We will be here taking care of you. But at the end of the day, it's your choice, and choice is a big part of safety. So anyway, they all got through it bar one of that first preparation, and 3 people arrived on our day one, which I like to call the threshold. It was interesting that the house actually literally had like a gated arch that you had to kind of walk under to get to it. And being that it was deep in a rainforest and the driveway was like a kilometre long through a forest, it had a feeling of threshold. It was perfectly designed by Mother Nature for that. So again, sense of safety. I wanted to make sure as people arrived that they felt they had time and space to land. Time and space, when I say land, I mean connect into the place, feel that they had enough privacy, because again, they don't know each other. So I didn't want to like shove everybody together and start singing Kumbaya immediately. I knew we would be doing that by the end, but in the beginning, it was just gentle, gentle, gentle. Give them a cup of tea, let them wander around, lots of time for them to get acquainted with the land. Even when it came to dinner, we didn't bring people together for dinner for that first night. We just put a big pot of really yummy soup or whatever it was on the stove, and we said, you get dinner when you want to. And, you know, my idea was that people would organically sit together if they felt they wanted to, or they might just not. They might just want to go for a walk. So no coercion, no sense of you have to. Again, really cultivating safety. We did come together for a evening ceremony, and I do a ancient Vedic fire ceremony. It's called Agnihotra. It's done right on the sunset, and it includes some beautiful chanting from the Vedic traditions. And when I did that, I was very clear in that I'm not imposing this on the participants. I'm just sharing something that works for me. This is one of my grounding practices. I like to do this if I'm feeling a bit wobbly at home. And I'm going to share this with you now. It's an ancient practice and this is what it means. So I was very explaining it all to them, so there was nothing kind of weird or woo-woo about it. And even on that first fire ceremony, I didn't ask people to contribute too much because again, you know, intimidating when you've only just met people. So we just kind of kept it light and got to know each other on a superficial level. Day 2 was our foundations day, and we're still building safety. This was when we did worldviews of psychosis. And so in other words, you are safe to believe what you want to believe. And we also worked on embodied safety. So we did some techniques to find safety in the body and connect with the emotion of safety or compassion or peace or whatever people chose to use, some breathing, that kind of thing. And we also were building rapport, which of course is safety. If we build trust together and we get to know each other, enjoying company, that creates safety. So by day 3, as planned, thank goodness, we had enough safety to move into mourning and remembrance, right? And this day I called the descent and the ascent. The first part of the morning was taking up with storytelling. We gave everyone a chance, our 3 participants. There was only time to do the participants and not the facilitators, but we asked them to share with us their stories of what had happened to them. And they could tell any part of it they wanted. They could begin at the very beginning. They could just tell a little bit of, you know, some hospital stay that they'd had or whatever they went through. They had a time limit, but I didn't sort of have to time keep too much. People seemed to naturally talk for about 45 minutes. And we had a weaving activity while we did it. So people didn't have to kind of stare at you while you were telling your story. It felt very relaxed as people did a weaving activity. And we were just lying around on couches and held in this beautiful bubble of mist, because it was still that rainy mist around us and we had a fire going. So people told their story one by one, and it was very, very moving. It was a beautiful chance to finally be heard. A lot of people who go through psychosis often have to hide the most meaningful parts of their story. They don't share it because they feel like no one will get it, or it'll be classified as another pathological aspect to what's going on for them. So that chance to just be heard was very, very powerful for people. I also knew that it would be kind of heavy and dark, and yes, there was a lot of tears, and it was, you know, some dark emotions. But I had planned it so that after that, in the afternoon, they would take a ceremonial / sacred / ritual walk to the waterfall. And the walk was actually a descent. It went down to the waterfall, and then they got into the waterfall, which was very cold. And they all did it to their credit. And then they came back out and walked up. And it was all done in silence. I said to them, look, this is your experience. It's not about a social experience. This is for you to walk the path of the descent, because psychosis is a kind of a descent into the hell realms, if that sounds a bit dramatic, but you know, people experience as something extremely scary and dark that they've gone through. So the descent and the ascent seemed like a perfect metaphor to help them go. They just told their story, so in a way they were sort of revisiting it. They were going back down. Then the bathing in the waterfall was a way to reset, to cleanse, to let go of anything they wanted to. And the ascent was a way to reclaim their sovereignty and their power, mimicking many mythic journeys, such as Persephone's descent into the underworld in ancient Greece, and there'd be many more besides. So that day was both mourning and remembrance, as well as reconnection. Because the highlight to me of the whole weekend was what happened next. We had, while everybody was down at the waterfall, my beautiful co-facilitators had completely redecorated the veranda with fairy lights and Japanese lanterns, and we had hired a musician to come and play didgeridoo and some handpan music, and some chefs, which treated us to this incredible feast. So unbeknownst to my beautiful participants, they thought we were just going to like bake them a cake or something, because I told them there was a little surprise. They were absolutely gobsmacked when they walked up from that waterfall and discovered that they were being treated like royalties. And that's how I wanted them to feel. I wanted them to feel like they had achieved something incredible. What they had been through and what they had overcome and how they had survived was worthy of that celebration. So we celebrated and we had an absolute blast that night. And I knew then that it had worked. On that night, it was like, I kind of let go as well. I was like, yeah, this done the job. People have reconnected. Day 4 was another integration day. We did a little bit more psychoeducation on energetic mastery, teaching people how to take care of their energy fields, and asking questions about all sorts of things that had come up. And day 5 was when we left, but I called it the transformation day, because that's when people gather up everything they've learned and take it home and really do feel that they have transformed. And I had to add in there, we had a debrief time as well, because I realized that we had a very intense experience. We'd all got along amazingly well, and it might be nice to just touch base with everybody afterwards. So I had another Zoom update about a week after the respite, just to make sure that they were all okay, which they were, which was awesome. So I'm just going to now, we're nearly there, talk about that embodied participation that was one of the points of the therapeutic milieu. And this picture speaks to it in a beautiful way, I think. Images say more than words sometimes. You've got to dive in. You've really got to dive in to know, to deeply transform and to know. And so, as I've written here, we never truly learn something until we've plunged our bodies, minds, and souls into the visceral act of doing it, thus activating the breathless moments of risk and thrill as we either sink or swim. And, I think this is why it was such a powerful experience for all of us, and myself included, because I was also plunging in. I was also doing the visceral act of doing it, something that I dreamed of for so long. And there was risks and there was thrills. And there was chances that we would sink or swim. And so I think living a little on the edge with that was exactly what we all needed to feel so transformed when we came out of it. Yeah. So the last one I'll just mention, which is, I shouldn't say just mention, because in a sense, I've left this to last because in hindsight, I feel it was the most important one. So it's this idea of validation, and it feels as if, you know, out of everything we did, it was the sitting around together and talking and being heard and being understood that counted for so much in the hearts and minds of all of us. Now, Judith Herman has something to say on this. She says, a well-organized group provides both a powerful stimulant for reconstruction of the survivor's story and a sustaining source of emotional support during mourning. And that storytelling time, that was the mourning, and being given that emotional support was very healing for people. And people gave us a ton of feedback while we were on it that validated it. But then afterwards, we also got some feedback here. So just to give the participants some voice in this presentation, this is Chris. She wrote, having the opportunity to tell my story with kindred spirits as witnesses was very meaningful. And another one from Justin. I feel more comfortable with myself and in myself. Isn't that interesting? Comfortable with myself and in myself after telling my story and listening to others with similar experiences. It has helped me to understand I'm not so alone. And Emma, the retreat was an inspired oasis for people to come together and share stories of survival, generate healing, create connection, all with added benefits of nurturing food and beautiful surrounds. And I tried to do a 6-month post-evaluation as well, because I was just mindful that when we all came off the high of the respite, that the evaluation was very, very positive. But I wanted to check. I was like a good researcher, just check in. How did things go after 6 months? Like, how had the effects of the respite played out in their lives? And unfortunately, the nature of these things, I only got one response back. So I present it to you now. Justin wrote, I've made a lot of peace with those that don't understand or appreciate me for who I am. So that's interesting. Speaks to how validation can act as an antidote to that judgment or that criticism that we get sometimes from general society around psychosis or non-ordinary states. And he also wrote, the storytelling was the best for me, and I continue to use this strength in my work and life. But the connection to nature was another aspect that I find has grown stronger from the respite. So that's fantastic win in my book. Okay, so just quickly, my conclusions. This picture is actually taken of a place called the Initiation Well in Portugal. It's a very mysterious well where you kind of walk all the way down to the bottom, and this is a view looking up. So I'm now looking up out of my cave. I've descended down, I've done this work, I'm looking up out of it. We got there. First of all, there was enormous relief, enormous joy. I'm not sure I've ever done anything quite so satisfying in my career. I guess partly because it was a dream of mine, but also because the results were so intensely powerful. So much more therapeutic than one-on-one work, which seems to take a long time and is more protracted. So yeah, I feel as if we have achieved a safe and nurturing space. We achieved opportunities for integration and validation, and we taught vital skills in grounding and energetic mastery, helping people manage their energy fields, their emotions, their thoughts. It seemed to me that the most healing and powerful element of the respite was the conscious storytelling with compassionate witnesses from caring peers, as I mentioned. But again, just to be a good researcher, I will say that there are limitations in this case study. And one is that I was working within what psychology would call a wicked learning environment as opposed to a kind one, which means that the feedback is not always clear or verifiable or reliable. So, feedback that comes from these things, there's a sense of loyalty that is built in when you bond like this in the forest for 5 days. which can skew the feedback. Again, I wasn't able to get all of those 6-month evaluative studies. So yeah, I'm just mindful, that this is it's limited in that sense. And my conclusions are contingent on repeated results. I really want to do this again and see if I'm sorry, I'll go back to that. See if I can repeat it. And the only two things I would do differently, which probably speak to that I do feel it was successful, I would try to lower prices to make it more affordable. This was very expensive to run. And yeah, it's just a limiting factor of who can then come on it. And I would also, my next one, I'm going to run it in April next year. I'm going to try running it for 3 nights instead of 4, and make the 4th as an optional extra for integration. I feel like we can actually do the work in 3 nights and then allow people to have a cheaper option or to go home if they need to for work. Cool. So, and that's me. If anybody does we're going to have some time for questions now, but if anyone does want to contact me, you're very, very welcome to. I'd love to hear your feedback or, just connect with people who are interested in all of this stuff. Cool. All right.
Thank you so much, Louisa, for that wonderful presentation. We have about 20 minutes for any questions. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions or enter them in the chat.
I have one.
Go ahead.
Thank you for this presentation. I feel like I got a real sense of what you all created together. And I think you kind of said bits and pieces of this, but I wonder if you could talk about how this felt different for you in terms of the treatment and healing and whatever kind of care you have received in your own personal experiences. And then also just what it was like for you both as experiencer and clinician to then run this program. Like, what was the real integration for you?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. Both of them are. If I think back to the mental health services that I received, I remember trying to create a retreat for myself in that period of 3 months unmedicated psychosis before I got to hospitals and the medical system. I went to stay at a friend's little cabin in the woods, and it was a disaster, honestly, an absolute disaster. I was far too ill to be on my own, and yeah, it was a very harrowing experience for me. I was extremely afraid, and that's why it was harrowing. So, and the person whose cabin it was completely unprepared to handle me, to help me. He was out of his depth altogether. I mean, there was times when I was mute and I couldn't talk. I was just scribbling art on pieces of paper, and I would write what I needed on a piece of paper. I remember writing, "I'm hungry," the saddest little note, and shoving it under the door. And then he bought me some soup. And that was about the poor man. I feel very sorry for him to these days when I think back on that. He tried his best. But the take home from that is that I think you need, it doesn't have to be professional necessarily, but you've got to have someone who can hold space for that. Now, of course, this is a post-psychosis respite, so it's not exactly the same. If I later compare it perhaps to hospitals where I would go in to get respite sometimes, where I wasn't like super ill, but I just still needed a space and a place to, reset. Yeah, I mean, I think what's missing there is most of the therapeutic milieu. The setting of a hospital is not soothing, is not welcoming and inviting, is certainly not in Australia. The hospitals that I stayed in, they're fluorescent lighting, and they're noisy, and they're ugly, and you're often sharing a room with somebody. And there was some validation. I think that was probably the nicest thing, was the peer support that you got from the other peers, the other patients. And there was elements of structure that were very helpful. And some of the the nursing staff and the doctors were wonderful as well. They were kind of like, I saw them as the leaders, the wise, kind, gentle leaders. So I think, it's a great question. I'm so glad you asked it because I've never even thought about it, but I probably took all of the best bits of those hospital stays and put them into this without even realizing I was doing that. Yeah, so if that answers your question. I hope it does. Yes. Yeah. All right. And the second part, how did it integrate for me? Well, it's validation on steroids in a way, because I guess when I was going through my struggles, I met enough people who had recovered to feel a sense of validation and a sense of role modeling from them and a sense that I could do it. But then to be the person providing that while at the same time listening to all these stories, it's almost like being like there's a part of me in the present time that's experiencing it as a facilitator and a leader. But then there's the other parts of me stuck back in time that went through the psychosis or is the old patient that feels so validated by hearing all these stories. So yeah, it was I guess it just added a deepening of the healing that I've already done. And it was a confirmation that my intuitions about what's needed are on track. That I think this kind of work, at least for the people I work with, and I'm certainly not arrogant enough to assume that I can help everybody. That's why I have such a tight screening process, because I know it needs to be a certain type of person, a person who's ready for it. Yeah, so it's validating and satisfying. That was the last thing, like deeply satisfying. So thanks for that question.
Yeah, thank you so
I
much.
also see a question in the chat, and then I see
Mm.
so you have your hand up as
And
well.
there's a
Um,
lady there too, yeah.
I will read the question in the chat first. So,
Yeah.
what is the best way to find a group that does something like this here in the US? Is there any type of association, so to speak, that could connect folks with an experience like this?
It might be something that's happening in the future. I don't know of any. I mean, there's peer respites, and I guess this is a peer respite. It's just a hybrid because it's also a retreat for psychosis. So, from my understanding, there's quite a robust peer respite system in the US. I certainly know I was very inspired years ago hearing about the peer respites in the US. We've got a couple of them in Australia, but they are, from my knowledge, a lot of them are, well, they're houses. So wherever they are, they might be in a suburb or something. So, so I guess they're not as cloistered as what I, was very deliberate in creating a cloistered environment, taking people completely away from any distractions. I don't even think we had Wi-Fi in the forest. So, so yeah, maybe that would be a good place to start anyways. My answer is to look into the peer respite movement. I haven't yet stumbled across anyone that's done this kind of thing in Australia or anywhere else, but I'm sure they're out there. It's kind of it's in the zeitgeist, isn't it? This idea. Yeah. So sorry, I'm not terribly helpful with that one.
And Lisa, for your question.
Thank you so much for sharing your experience of creating this. Could you speak a little bit, you mentioned the impact that this 5-day experience had on your participants versus one-on-one therapy over time. And can you just expand more on that? I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah. Well, the first thing that comes to mind is it's the group. There's just the power of the group. You can definitely have a beautiful impact on someone one-on-one, and a lot of my healing has been done one-on-one. I've had some incredible therapists that have essentially reparented me and taught me what it feels like to feel validated, loved, cared for, and understood on an emotional, psychological level. So it's not about getting rid of that at all or dismissing it, but I think it gets amplified. I think when you bring a group of people together, it's not just 6 people, so it's 6 times greater than the one-on-one. I think it's exponential. I think the frequency is really quite magnificent that we can generate together. Something about the group. It's, you know, I'm not even the irony of this, to be honest, is I'm not actually a big group fan. Like when I'm as a facilitator, I probably prefer to work one-on-one. It's easier, right? You've just got one person in front of you. You can fully focus on them. Working with a group, you are managing and mitigating energies. You're trying to synthesize, you're trying to harmonize all of those energies. But perhaps that's also where the magic lies, because there can be something that one person in that group offers somebody else that I could never have foreseen, and it would never have come from me, right? So there was one thing that's interesting actually about the experience, I reflected on it afterwards, is that there was a lot going on that respite that I have no idea about, right? I'm talking about conversations. There was a few people that smoked, so the smokers would go off to the smokers bit and they would have these deep conversations out there. I wasn't there for that. Another time I remember getting up at like 4 a.m. in the morning or something to go to the toilet, and there was a couple of participants had started the campfire and was sitting out there having a really deep yarn under the stars, you know. So there was stuff going on that I don't know about, and that's part of the magic. So maybe it's got to do with yeah, surrendering, definitely, you know, surrendering to the possible the kind of chaos that happens in a group just naturally, because there's lots of different influences of energy, but then the order that comes out of that chaos, the implicit order that creates, by the end of 5 days anyway, a real sense of harmony. So yeah, perhaps I don't know if that's a bit abstract, the way that I've answered that, but that's how I see it, that there is this magic and power in a group that you just can't get one-on-one. And then also there's the time. So we compressed everything into 5 days, and it's the embodied participation part, because when I'm sitting talking to someone, occasionally I'll do embodied processing work with them, where I get them to go in and feel their feelings and re-script, like very similar to what Professor Steele does with the imagining, the re-scripting. We do that on a somatic level. We use the body, we use emotions. That's very embodied, but that's as far as it goes. A lot of it is talking. So to actually go and do something together, to cook meals together, to walk together, to sit around a fire together. I mean, Justin was our only man, and I had him on the very first day out there chopping wood, because that's the man's thing. So you go do that and make the fire for us girls. And then that gives him, you know, that sense of I'm useful, I'm a man. So there are so many other things that you can play with other than just you and the other person in the therapy room, which is generally what one-on-one is. So yeah, that's another aspect to it.
MP, I see your hand up.
Hi, yeah, thank you. I was just wondering if you could comment on the way that the temporary or transient nature of the group of people you brought together affected the experience. I mean, you talked kind of as a model at the beginning, and just kind of thinking about those as being happening inside the context of a kind of permanent community, whereas kind of you flew people from all over the world, or negative, or just kind of, was there any kind of like, did the group maintain itself? I know you only got one person's feedback, but was there like any communication afterwards, or just that aspect of things?
Yeah, awesome question. So perhaps I'm comfortable with transient therapeutic milieus, let's call it that, because of my background in hospitals. So I was not only a patient in many, many hospitals, but I was also a peer worker for years in hospitals. And I kind of love that transience of a hospital. You know, you never know who's coming in, who's going out. I would just walk into a room as a peer worker and be met by someone I never knew who they were, and get to know them, and they'd be gone the next day. And so I got comfortable with transience, and so it kind of suited me anyway. I hadn't ever asked myself this question, so I'm really glad you have. And as I reflect on it now, I feel like it was a similar experience to being at the hospitals, where people make fast friendships with the right conditions. By the end of it, everyone just adored each other. I know two of the people who live in the same city. They went back to that city and they're still maintaining relationships and seeing each other as friends. So that's lovely, because they formed a really beautiful friendship. The other lady lives a long way away from anyone, so she hasn't had that capacity to stay in touch. But she's on texting terms. She sort of texts me bits and pieces sometimes, and lets me know how she's going. So it feels like we went through something that will never be forgotten, and those bonds will always be remembered in all of our hearts. Another analogy that springs to mind actually is theatre, because I used to do a lot of theatre when I was younger, and we'd put stage plays together, and that was also transient. You come together for something, you achieve something, you just adore these people, and then it all sort of falls, it all ends and off you go and live your lives, but they hold a special place in your heart. So I didn't see it as a limitation. And I guess I haven't really thought about if I would ever do anything more permanent than that. And that might just be due to my bias, as I said before, my own kind of, I guess I like to kind of get in, do some work and then leave. That's how I am in a lot of areas of my life. So yeah, so it suits me, and it seemed to suit everybody else. But yeah, it's a very good question, and one to contemplate. And just on that, I want to kind of add that I presented this today as a point of inspiration. Somebody else out there might have been thinking of doing something similar or whatever, but you can never make a formula out of these things. The way that I've run it could act as a guide for someone else, but because every facilitator, every leader, every conceiver is going to be different in their strengths, in their abilities, in what they like to do, they're all going to be unique. And so, I think as practitioners, we need to honor ourselves as a tool, as a very influential tool in the way that things unfold, and not try to kind of, I'm not saying that your question was suggesting this, but it's just a point that popped into my head, is that we don't need to copy each other. Yeah. And that's what I love about things like the Hearing Voices movement, is it's so loose. It holds space for all these different styles and modalities and ways of expressing and ways of healing. And I'm very much a fan of that multiplicity, of just allowing it all and accepting that some things are going to work for some people and some things are going to work for other people. And I've just found myself a little pocket where I feel like really comfortable to do what I'm doing. And I'm going to, keep providing that and just helping whoever comes across my path. Yeah.
Thank you, Louisa. That's so beautiful. We're running up on time. We have about 5 minutes left, but I see Lisa, you raised your hand.
Yeah, if it's all right to ask another question. I don't see.
No, please do.
I don't want to dominate this questions. Louisa, it seems like there's been like in the program there, you had like formal storytelling time, you had informal connections over meals around the fire while smoking, and then there was like this psychoeducation, which seemed to be structured. And I'm just wondering, like, the impact of the formal psychoeducation frameworks that you offered and how it wove into the participant experience and the impact. Like, I'm just experiencing like that formal psychoeducation in hospital settings, and how that like translated in this setting.
Yeah, well, it was very deliberate and thought about, because like I said in that slide about structure with the path through the forest, that if you don't have a path to follow, the forest can feel frightening. And lack of structure can make people feel ungrounded, unsure of what's about to happen. So I was very deliberately trying to create a balance. I didn't want them to spend all day listening to lectures and psych education and doing things that they maybe didn't feel like doing. But I wanted them to spend enough of the day knowing that, okay, this is happening between, I don't know, 10 to 12, and then I've got some free time. So roughly we would sort of do our psychoeducation or whatever we were doing activity in the morning from 10 till 12. Then we would let them have a break, and then we would do something in the afternoon again, another hour or two. So it wasn't crammed full of things to do and overly structured, because I wanted them to also have time to reflect, go on their own walks, look up at the stars, like whatever they needed to do, and connect into nature. That was the other thing about, if I had packed it too much, they wouldn't have had time to stop and notice the interesting birds or listen to the rain falling on the roof, or that stuff was important too. So it was very much about creating a balance. And as for the weaving of it together, that's why I launched the whole thing on the day one with the worldviews of psychosis, because I wanted to give them something really, really interesting to like mull over and integrate for the next few days. So my hope was that the conversations that followed on from that worldviews on psychosis would be, well, what do you think your psychosis is, and how do you explain yours? And of course, that's exactly what happened. Like, there were lots of conversations about, for some people it was a Kundalini awakening, or they had a very sort of shamanic, metaphysical worldview of what had gone on for them. For other people, it was different. Everyone had different ideas. So those conversations got all the more richer because of that session. At least that's my take on it. Like I said, I wasn't privy to all of those conversations, but yeah. And then the other thing we did is we kind of were able to like modify the content as we went. So on the third day, on the Sunday, on the integration day, we did a section on energetic mastery, and that was based a lot on the questions that had been coming up. So people wanted to know about spiritual dimensions, unseen dimensions, and entities and energies coming in, and how to protect themselves, and like all that kind of stuff. So we were not going to go there unless people asked for it. We just wanted to sort of be directed by their needs. But sure enough, they did ask for it. So yeah, so we had a really rich discussion on that day. Yeah, so it was definitely a co-creation in that sense. Yeah.
I think we are running up on time. I want to say thank you so much to Louisa for her presentation today. And this...
Oh, Sonia, there's one question in the chat. Is the presentation on the worldviews? No, it's not, but I'm going to be doing I've got a YouTube channel, and I've got quite a bit of material up there, and I'm working on a kind of a abbreviated version of it. So if you go to my website, sign up to my newsletter. It's very occasional. I promise you, I don't have time to send you loads of spam. And then that way you can kind of keep up with it. If I have any great material to share, I will through my website. So sorry, Sonia.
No, that was a good ending. Yes, the website, and then it's good to meet everyone this morning. All right. Take good care, you guys.
Yeah. Thanks so much. Enjoy the rest of it, everyone. Bye.